Marco Polo, His Travels and Adventures, Chapter 7, Part 2. Marco found this palace, in its general appearance, not unlike that at Shandu, but far larger in the size of its apartments, and far more magnificent in its decorations. The hall was reached by a broad flight of porphyry steps, and this room was so long that it held 6,000 persons at its banquet table. Its walls were fairly crusted with gold and silver, and on them were emblazoned enormous figures of dragons, horses, dolphins, tigers, suns, and full moons. The apartments within this palace seemed to Marco fairly innumerable, and all the chambers were as gorgeously decorated as was the hall itself. The roof especially attracted his attention, for it was painted red, blue, and green, and so thickly varnished that it glistened in the sun. Quadrangle after quadrangle succeeded each other, in the center of which spurted fountains, stood basins full of fish, and grew trees of rarest bloom and verdure. All the surroundings of the palace were fairly delicious. Marco found a large artificial lake a few rods away, upon which barges so painted and gilded as fairly to dazzle him, gaily floated. This lake was alive with the greatest variety of fish, which daily supplied the Khan's table. Near the lake rose an artificial hill, perhaps 40 feet high, even on every side, which the Khan had planted completely over with evergreens that preserved their soft and genial color the year round. This was called the Green Mountain, and on its summit was the prettiest pavilion imaginable, whence a view of all the surrounding country might be enjoyed. It was one of the Khan's pet hobbies to cover this eminence with the rarest trees, which he caused to be brought thither from the remotest parts of Tartary and planted. How my brother Maffeo and my uncle Marco would wonder to see all this splendor, mused Marco. When I get home and tell them about it, they will not believe me. The palace stood on the banks of a river, and it was on the other bank of this river that the city of Kambalu, which means City of the Khan, stood. It was, Marco saw, a large city, some 24 miles around, and built regularly in squares, and it stood on or near the site which the great Chinese city of Pekin now occupies. It was entirely surrounded by a thick and lofty earthen wall, through which, on the several sides, 12 gates gave admission to the streets. On either side of these gates were square towers, which were always filled with heavily armed troops. The streets were really broad, straight avenues, and were lined with wide-spreading trees, and along them were to be seen many fine palaces and temples. Marco saw a very high building in the very center of the city, on which was a steeple containing a large bell. This bell, he learned, was rung at nightfall 3 times. This was a signal that the great gates were closed, and that no one could enter or go out of the city until the next day. Kambalu was a very busy place. It was full of rich merchants who drove a thriving trade, and its bazaars were every day crowded with eager traders dealing in every imaginable kind of wares. From India came to the bazaar stalls precious stones and rich fabrics, and from the Australian islands delicious spices and fruits, while Cathay itself supplied them with an abundance of food and cloths. The suburbs of the city stretched away over the hills beyond the walls as far as eye could reach on either side, and Marco's head ached when he tried to guess how large the population of Kambalu and its vicinity could be. Marco had not long been at Kambalu before he learned that the Khan had a large number of wives. Of these, 4 were held in higher honor than the rest and were called empresses. Each of these empresses was entitled to take the Khan's name, and each had a separate court of her own with a palace all to herself. Each empress was attended by no less than 10,000 persons, among whom were 300 of the loveliest maidens of Cathay. It was a great honor to belong to an empress's court, and all the young girls of the country were anxious to be chosen among this band. By his 4 empresses, the Khan had 22 sons, and by his other wives, no less than 25 more. And this numerous family lived, one and all, in the greatest splendor and state. The Khan's court, as Marco had seen it at Shandu, was as nothing compared with the court he held at Kambalu. He was constantly guarded by 12,000 horsemen. After one body of horsemen had served him 3 days and 3 nights, they were replaced by another body of the same number. And wherever the Khan went, he was attended by this military array. Marco marveled at nothing more than the magnificent feasts which the Khan gave on the occasion of an imperial or religious festival. The great banqueting hall of the palace served as the scene of these feasts. At these times the monarch himself sat at a table at one end of the hall, raised on a dais high above the rest, facing the south. On his left sat his favorite wife, and on his right his sons and nephews. On a lower platform were stationed the great nobles of the state with their wives, and lower down still on the floor were seated the lower dignitaries of Kublay's court. In the very center of the hall, between the long rows of groaning tables, stood an immense basin of solid gold, and on either side 2 smaller ones, all filled to overflowing with the choicest wine, and from thence the attendants took the beverage in flagons to the feasters. 2 guards of lofty stature were stationed at each door of the banqueting hall with heavy staves. These saw to it that no one who entered or went out touched the threshold, for this was a serious offense in a royal apartment. Marco observed that those who waited upon the Khan and his family, who were nobles of high degree, had their mouths closely wrapped up in silk and gold towels, and soon learned that this was to keep them from breathing upon the dishes destined for the imperial palate. As soon as the Khan raised his goblet to drink, the trumpets and drums made a great noise in every part of the hall, and the nobles, leaving their chairs, fell all at once on their knees and raised their hands in a sort of supplicating attitude above their heads, and this happened every time the Khan quaffed his wine. While the feast was thus going forward in the great hall, multitudes were eating and drinking to their heart's content in the smaller apartments surrounding it. In all, it was said that 40,000 people feasted at once within the palace walls. Many of these were nobles or merchants who came from distant parts of the empire and who had brought costly gifts to the Khan. The eating and drinking over, the tables were cleared and moved aside. The vast company gathered in a semicircle on the floor. A lofty throne was placed for the Khan on the dais, and forthwith in came a host of dancers, singers, magicians, and jugglers, who, in the open space below the monarch, entertained the multitude with the exhibition of their various talents. Marco was especially struck with the jugglers, who performed seemingly impossible feats, and tumbled about greatly to the risk, as he thought, of breaking their necks. Among the chief festivals that took place at court were those which celebrated the Khan's birthday and the incoming of the new year, which, in Cathay, began in February. On his birthday, the Khan was wont to array himself in a robe of beaten gold, and all his court wore their most gorgeous apparel. The feast was preceded by a solemn ceremony in the principal temple, and after this presents were offered to the Khan by a multitude of his subjects who came from every part of the country, and also by neighboring princes. A still more splendid festival was that called the White Feast, which ushered in the new year. On that day, the entire population of the Khan's empire attired themselves in white from head to foot. It was customary on this occasion also to offer gifts to the monarch. Indeed, these occasions for making him presents came very often, and served to enrich him beyond calculation. On New Year's Day, the presents usually consisted of gold and silver ornaments, rare gems, and costly white cloths, white horses, camels, and elephants. these animals also bearing on their backs boxes and packages of presents, and being habited in the richest apparel. The ceremony of receiving these offerings and of celebrating the day was a most imposing one. The Khan and all his court repaired in splendid attire to the great hall of the palace, and ranged themselves in order of rank around the sides. As soon as all had occupied their places, a high priest advanced in the center and said, in a loud voice, "Kneel and adore." Whereupon all fell upon their knees, struck their foreheads with their hands, and, turning to the Khan, rendered him homage as if he were a god. Then the crowd advanced to an altar where the priest poured out incense in the Khan's honor. This ceremony over, the Khan, followed by the rest, went out upon the flight of steps leading up to the principal portal of the palace, and, as he stood there, beneath a glittering canopy, fanned by peacock fans, and the center of a dazzling galaxy of silk and jewels, the elephants, camels, and horses that bore his innumerable presents passed by in slow procession. All the animals were taught to kneel when they came opposite the Khan, and it took several hours for the long train, bearing its countless treasures, to pass. After this, the banquet took place, and on New Year's night, every one at the Khan's court felt at liberty to become intoxicated and to indulge in such wild capers as the wine inspired them to commit. The wine thus drunk was seasoned with rice and rich spices, and was very strong. At all these festivals and merrymakings, the Polos were not only permitted to be present, but were honored with places in the midst of the nobles. The Khan's favor, which was fully and openly bestowed upon the Venetian strangers, served to procure them the goodwill and friendship of his courtiers. All this while, Marco was learning what seemed to him the endless language of Cathay. He found it a great deal harder than French, which he had studied as a boy at home. But in due time he found that he could converse quite easily with his Tartar companions, and heard every day something new and strange about the land in which he was sojourning.